Hello, and welcome to another edition of One Big Question here on the Modern Software Engineering channel. Joining me, Kevlin Henney, and Dave Farley. And the one big question we are going to answer is, what does CD without automation look like? But before we get into this, there's a couple of things. First of all, if you like this, give us a like, and if you'd like to see more of it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And this particular One Big Question is being brought to you by a sponsor.
This episode is sponsored by Octopus Deploy, and we'd like to thank them for their ongoing support of our channel and of this episode.
Right. So here's the thing. Normally we associate CD with automation. It is the kind of like the pinnacle of any kind of like competent delivery team's ability to deliver. But I think it is an interesting question. What happens if we take some or all of that away? And actually, I mean, Dave, you're the man on this one. Give us a definition of CD and we can kind of take it from there and see what we can take away and still see if it's CD.
So my preferred practical working definition for continuous delivery is working so that our software is always in a releasable state. And I think you're absolutely right. Mostly we assume that we aim to make sure that that determination of releasability is on an automated basis, because that's the most efficient way of getting an answer to that question. But there's no absolute reason why that should be true, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, and actually importantly, there was a point, something you mentioned there about, you talked about efficiency, and there's that kind of suggestion that we can actually still have something that is still effective and relatively efficient, because what effectively we're doing is automating a set of practices and making sure that as soft, squishy humans, we don't forget stuff, that we don't skip a step. There's the idea of this happens and I have to put no additional effort into it, then it happens in the background. We just attach things to the pipeline. We put another stage in, we do that. But I think an interesting way to come to this, and I think this the thought that I had on this one when we started exploring this as a question, so I remember that the original, just scaling back from CD to continuous integration, so CI, the CI part of it was the original extreme programming. I remember kind of listening to Kent Beck talk about it and reading Extreme Programming Explained. And there, continuous integration was done without a lot of automation. I mean, there was a version control system, but it wasn't a concurrent versioning system. And it was done multiple times a day, but very much as a social thing.
Yes.
It relied on, I suddenly realized, this relies on a team discipline. It relies on making it an event within the team, but also it tells you about the way the team's working. And I thought, well, yeah, you don't actually need, it doesn't say that all the software is not, we're not saying it's not useful, but it's not a necessary precondition to have a good flow, is to have the automation. The automation takes something and helps us make it more efficient. But there's a suggestion that maybe there's something it gives us a head start, but there's something already in place by the time you start doing this stuff.
In the original continuous delivery book, Jez and I had a description of continuous integration that included a bell and a rubber chicken.
Yeah.
That's all you needed.
Yeah. So there's that suggestion that there are all of these steps, and it's a bit like kind of a checklist mentality, but also it's the case of like outsourcing the grunt work from the humans to something automated. But what if we take some of that away? And clearly there are elements here that retain the continuousness, even if we don't have full automation. The automation allows us to do something better and speed it up. But yeah, it's a kind of a thought. It allows us obviously to work distributed.
Yes, so absolutely, the automation is going to make it easier if we're a distributed team. Also, there's something about the scale of the problem. There's something about the scale and complexity of the software that we're evaluating. If we're writing a piece of code that says 2 + 2 = 4, that's not going to take an awful lot of validation to determine whether it's giving the right answer or not. And so we can probably, even if we make changes to that, we can probably release that fairly quickly by just trying it out manually and seeing what happens. If we're releasing, I don't know, the Android operating system or something,
yeah,
there's probably a few more evaluations that we'd like to carry out.
Yeah.
And this is something that I perceive as being going on quite a lot at the moment, with some people being rather naive about evaluating AI-driven software development. because that's one of these things where, where we're generating code more quickly, very often with AI. And if we're doing that, then the speed with which we're able to verify that it's right has to go up to match the rate at which we're generating the code. And so just looking at it and playing with it probably isn't enough.
I was just thinking that point about scale, and it's interesting you mentioned the Android operating system there, because I remember the first time I was exposed to daily builds, just simple overnight builds in the early 1990s, and automating overnight builds. And it was one of those things of just like, okay, we always have a system on a daily basis, not a continuous within a day, but on a daily basis. We have this because we kind of, somebody picked up the idea that, hey, guess what? Microsoft have a once a day build of their whole operating system. And it's just like, oh, okay, yeah, well, we can do that. It's not as big. What we have is less than 1 million lines of code rather than many million lines of code, but it's still pretty big. And trying to get everybody doing that manually it's doable, but it requires a little bit more. But clearly we're at a point now that, bells and rubber ducks are not going to work. Scale of organization, distribution, and subbase. So what we've got here is a kind of a scaling, a rate thing and that starts telling us where our bottlenecks are, which again goes back to the AI question about people are moving the bottleneck around.
And also, I suppose it's where we draw the line as automation. So I, for one, would be feeling fairly nervous if we did away with the automation of a version control system.
Yeah.
So if we could start off assuming that we had a version control system and did away with everything else, I can imagine scenarios where that might work. I have a war story from a friend of mine. We'd been working together on a fairly large, sophisticated system, and we'd been pushing the boundaries of continuous delivery on that system. That was at LMAT. And after that, he'd gone on. He was a good friend, and he was very, very good as a software developer and a good leader. And he'd gone on to this small startup with a very junior, inexperienced team. And so he kind of completely got sold on the idea of continuous delivery while working at LMAX. And then he went into this team, and so he was going to lead this team, and so he was introducing all of these ideas, but they hadn't got the hang of any of it really. They hadn't got continuous integration working. They hadn't got any automated tests. They hadn't really regularized their build enough. The release process was too manual and all of that. But he just adopted the cycle.
Yeah.
We were in a pub one day, and he said, the thing that scares me to death is that even without all of that stuff, it still works better than the alternative.
Yeah.
And that was because they were making small changes. And so they're making small changes so they could understand the nature of each change and manually check that change and then release stuff. It also helps that they hadn't got any users that really cared very much.
Yeah.
So if they broke something, it wasn't disastrous.
Yeah. So I think that kind of, it suggests to me the point you're talking about there is small steps in iteration. And it's kind of interesting that, you can take away elements and that, automation becomes the multiplier, but it does raise the question of, in terms of scale and rate and all these things, but it also invites the question like multiplier of what? And the effectiveness ultimately still comes down at some level to what are people prepared to put in, because I'm sure you've seen it a lot, and I've certainly encountered it, that a lot of people going around, we got a CD pipeline, and actually they've got the tools, they've got the machinery, but there's a lot missing, and sometimes they're not working in small steps at all. Sometimes they're getting lost or in distant branching territory, and they still have ridiculous amounts of merge hell that we'd normally only have like, old school, it would take a month or 2 months to generate that.
Yeah.
And then people are missing bits, like then leaving out the testing. In other words, RCD, it's just like, well, you just kind of like, you can kind of compiled it and then you shipped it, and kind of seem to be missing some really important steps here. And so it kind of suggests that sometimes the access and availability of having the machinery available doesn't guarantee you actually have CD. You've got the parts, you've got the puppeted parts, but it doesn't play out. So I think that's quite interesting as well as a kind of like a counterpoint.
Absolutely. So I did a video a while ago about the 14 markers of continuous delivery. There's the 14 ideas that are kind of hallmarks that you've got working continuous delivery, one of which is automated testing, but I can't really imagine it without. But I think there's quite a few of those things where you could imagine some flavor of those things without automation in some special circumstances. And so that idea of working so that your software is always maintained in a releasable state and making the steps small enough so that you're able to tell whether after each change it's releasable fairly easily seems viable. It seems like you could imagine that working in some limited circumstances. And, really it's the small steps and that keeping that it functioning that are the absolute 100% fundamentals. And the tooling after that, as you say, is kind of nice to have, but not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough on its own. Because you can absolutely have all of the tools and not get any of the benefits or be following any of the practices.
I think that's the interesting thing, is that sometimes people do, there is this idea that initially it sounds like a ridiculous question, but even as a thought experiment, but also looking back at history, it's just like, well, hang on, people have been doing this effectively without this degree of automation, but obviously there are limits in terms of scale, distribution, and so on, and rate of change. But then that alternative, we've seen lots of people who have the right tools. They got all the toys, and yet it doesn't seem to be working for them. And you end up with a multiplier of, actually, you don't have a great process. You don't have appropriate discipline here. And that's what you're multiplying. And so you got a sewage pipeline rather than a CD pipeline. And most of your re-release, the reason we continuously have to deliver is to fix all the problems that we discover that could have been fixed. But actually, so in other words, it's continuous patching rather than actually continuous delivery of new functionality. And I think a lot of people do that.
I think you're absolutely right. That again is kind of an analog to what we see with people adopting AI, where you just kind of build crap systems faster.
And you hit different bottlenecks, and you're driving up the failure demand. You're constantly playing this problem, or constantly fixing things that are broken, which is not the idea of CD. It is, that's not the idea. But sometimes people do that, and I've certainly seen a couple of posts and heard more than a couple of confessions, and a couple of them actually in videos, where people have perhaps praised CD and also architectural choices for reasons we would not normally worry about, and that one of us like, well, we get a few bugs, and then we get a lot of bugs, but we fix them because we've got CD. And it's just like, that is a benefit, but that's not the point of it. Maybe you're driving the pipeline from the wrong point of view.
Yeah, we were hoping for something else.
Exactly. So I think that point that we've got here is that the tooling, the automation is at a particular point of scale and for a particular kind of development, you regard as absolutely necessary. Below that, you'd say, well, it's odd perhaps that you're not doing it, but it might not be as problematic as it might be in a large organization with larger software. So it's obviously a recommendation, but it turns out that at a particular point, it's actually not a necessity, and you could still be doing better than many teams who have the machinery and have the toys. And clearly having all of the tooling is going the other way. It's not a guarantee that you're actually doing CD in its intended form, that you're not getting the benefits. You've multiplied the weaknesses of your organization and your development team.
So I guess in summary, what we're saying is that it can work in some circumstances, and the fundamentals are important. Our ability to make progress in small steps and validate each small step and get fast feedback on each small step is really what matters. And then to do that in systems of any kind of real world level of complexity, that really demands some level of automation realistically to get the feedback in a timely enough manner. But it's the fundamental idea of those small steps and working so your software is always releasable that are the fundamental underpinning of what CD really means. I think that's what is in my head.
I think that, there's a philosophical basis, but also a discipline basis, and therefore, what is it that you're multiplying? And we might actually say, I mean, in the goal, that ultimately the goal is the opposite of what people are, opposite phrase that people are using a lot at the moment, is we want human out of the loop. It turns out that computers are really good at automating all of this extra kind of stuff.
Yes.
And actually, we're a weak link when it comes to that. And so we should not be relied on. That's the value of automation here.
Yes.
It acts as a multiplier of your discipline, but also it's going to strengthen that and remove. We are the weak link in the chain when it comes to scaling and increasing rates. That's us. We are the weak link in the chain, and we don't want that.
It's one of the things that I've said quite. Yeah, one of the things that I've said quite often is that humans aren't repeatable and reliable.
Oh, right. So I have a similar phrase: "Is humans aren't good at for loops." It's not our strength. We get a bit bored after a while. We get things a bit wrong. But you want something done a million times reliably. Yeah, sure. The software is this is what computers are good at. So yeah. But I think that is a very reasonable conclusion.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for watching. We'll see you again soon.